There were two main reasons why Arthur did not leave his post as a full-time journalist for the local major newspaper: his love for journalism as an art and the lack of any alternatives in the city itself. He didn't go to bigger cities on purpose, rightly believing that no one would need him there. And it was unlikely that he would have settled there after the sleepy town, where all the news came late. The newspaper itself was a 6-sheet paper of poor quality, published every 2 weeks. The biggest news, as usual, was on the first page, just under the large printed title. The last part of the paper was occupied by announcements, obituaries, and congratulations. And in the middle section, you could find Arthur's work, which was literally made up out of whole cloth. And, let's face it, sometimes he lied a little bit. Well, as a little, it was a quiet town, peacefully drifting somewhere on the fringe of the event horizon. And to shake up its placid existence, Arthur would make up news stories with clickbait headlines. Preserved in alcohol mouse bites student. This was followed by 2 columns about the mouse itself, which had so inappropriately come to life in a biology class and, jumping out of a half-liter jar, bit the finger of a 16-year-old boy. A number of measures were taken to save the life of the victim, and the mouse was immediately caught and burned. It was said to burn perfectly well, like a torch, for it was literally soaked with alcohol. A doll made of teeth was found in the hanged man's house. Arthur clung at times to stories that had actually taken place. There was one, indeed, one of the many drunks here who lived in a house on the outskirts of town. The town itself consisted mostly of small apartment buildings, but there were still some dilapidated single-family houses on the outskirts. In such a house they found a dead man hanging from the attic rafters, who, due to his own uselessness both in life and after death, had been hanging there for at least 6 months. In winter he had frozen and hung there, probably covered with frost, and when spring came, followed by summer, and the roof warmed up, he announced itself with a bad odor. Arthur, who had an extreme degree of curiosity combined with intrusiveness, visited the place. He took some photographs, but the editor-in-chief did not allow them to be printed, and the upset Arthur embellished the text as best he could, especially when describing the doll made of sod nailed to the same rafters, which was allegedly stuffed with real human teeth. It goes without saying that everyone in town knew, or if they didn't know, at least suspected, that the articles signed by Arthur James contained some truth in them, but they discussed the new articles with curiosity. The most devoted fans made compilations of the most gruesome stories. These then grew into whole folders that passed from hand to hand. And the prolific author Arthur wrote more. But he had a dream, like almost every human being. And Arthur was able to fulfill it, which could not afford not everyone. And his dream was to give such article, which would provide him with the chair of editor-in-chief, for example. And that would be an opportunity to bring the newspaper to a higher level of quality. Let's say, better paper, more pages. Maybe even color photos. At this point, Arthur wistfully recalled the footage of the hangman. There was nothing going on in the neighborhood, so Arthur lived waiting for the very story that would give him a ticket to a more or less satisfactory future. But time passed, the city and its neighborhood continued to sleep, and nothing more exciting than a drunken shootout at a convenience store did not happen here. Arthur asked his friends and their acquaintances, picking up all sorts of gossip and rumors, trying to cling to something. There was no findings to be had, even though Artut was an fantasist, but he was not without a realistic view of the world. and in the midst of the ordinary reality, something suitable had finally turned up. The orphanage stood a couple of dozen kilometers from the edge of the town, just off the highway. He had to turn onto a dirt road, where water always accumulated in ruts and holes after the rains. After 10 minutes of bumping, causing weakness even in the most prepared stomachs, the forest parted and revealed a low concrete fence, placed more to mark the boundary of the territory than as an obstacle. Behind it stretched a yard rolled up in long ago cracked asphalt and a strip of trampled lawn with swings and a slanting merry-go-round. The gate was ajar, a gesture that denotes not hospitality, but rather indifference to the fact that anyone can get in and out, and a weather-beaten sign that read Orphanage Number 14. That's what Arthur wrote in his draft. No one paid attention to the car that pulled up to the gate. No one looked out of the windows to greet the guests. Apathy, indifference, humility before tomorrow, and hope that it will not be worse than the previous day. Orphanage Number 14 bears a significant resemblance to a long-abandoned barracks rather than a dwelling where children play and learn. Constructed of gray panels, it squints blindly at the curtained windows, which even on this sunny day seem deafening and dark. It wouldn't be surprised if the house has been empty for the last few years. Slamming the door of the old Ford, Arthur looked around, feeling somewhat confused. Writing about the problems of the children's institution, which was financed from unknown sources and obviously not enough, judging by the general dilapidation, a good deed, but he expected to see at least a couple of people playing in the yard. But not a deafening emptiness, disturbed only by the sounds of the surrounding forest. The long rusted hinges of the gate shrieked at a frequency unacceptable to the human ear. With a wince, Arthur stepped into the yard and headed resolutely straight for the porch. Mentally, he was thinking his impressions into a perfect text, which would then come to life on paper. The crunch of sand on asphalt, the rustle of grass, the crumbled porch steps and railing, ironed to a shine by thousands of touches. Something shining brightly on the railing, blowing sunlight spots into his eyes. Arthur squinted and, coming closer, found the source of the glitter, a couple of large shards of bottle glass. One was brown, probably from beer. The other was green, the source was a mineral water bottle. He picked up the brown glass and looked through it at the sun for some reason, risking burning his retinas. "If it's not yours, don't touch it," said someone's voice sullenly. Arthur shuddered and almost dropped the glass. A child was looking at him unkindly through the bars of the railing, with his short haircut, his t-shirt faded from the sun and many washes. Reaching up, he clutched both glass shards in his hand with the dexterity of a monkey and jumped back onto the asphalt. "I won't," Arthur repented. The house wasn't so abandoned, but it still looked dilapidated. The boy didn't answer. He carefully wiped both glasses with the hollow of his t-shirt, slipped them into the pocket of his sweatpants, and stared at Arthur with both eyes wide open. "I'm Arthur," he said, hurriedly introducing himself. "I'm a representative for the local newspaper. I'm going to write a story about this house." The occupant of Orphanage Number 14 blinked. He had no apparent interest in Arthur's identity. He took the green glass out of his pocket and looked at Arthur through it. The boy suddenly stretched his lips in a not very pretty smile and changed from anger to mercy. "Right. My name is William. But don't look through the brown glass anymore, or you'll see things." "Will you take me to one of the educators?" Arthur asked, looking at William and rapidly retaining in his memory the first impressions of his appearance. And he couldn't resist asking, "And why can't I look through the brown glass?" William did not answer at once. He stowed his treasure back in his pocket, then coughed and walked around the porch to the door of the house. It wasn't until he opened the door and took a step inside that he spoke, because through the brown glass shows some things. and the green shows things as they are. He had to be satisfied with this explanation. Officially, Miss Stevenson is listed as a senior caretaker, but de facto she does all the work that she can do during the day, because the staff is very limited. So she has to take on extra duties for a salary of a couple $100, money that is not even enough to pay the utilities. If not me, then who? Mrs. Stevenson says of her job, sighing. Here Arthur had to embellish reality, because Mrs. Stevenson actually met him with a furious hurricane and onslaught, simultaneously demanding answers for the meager funding and apologizing for the unpresentable appearance of both the home and its residents. Look at that, if you'll fall over, you won't be able to pick up any bones, Mrs. Stevenson explained, picking up a layer of parquet that had been trampled down to a white base with foot. So we nail it on the edge, but it doesn't hold a damn thing. Mrs. Gillen almost broke her nose the other day when she tripped on the edge. Arthur scribbled a few lines in his notebook with a pencil. The hall was illuminated, one after another, by several camera flashes. Over the course of a couple hours, Mrs. Stevenson gave Arthur a brief tour of both floors of the facility. She took him to the basement, showed him the puddle of standing water on the floor that had leaked from the pipes. Then she took him to the kitchen, which smelled of rags. Next a classroom, children's rooms. There were surprisingly few children here. A recreation room. Everywhere, devastation and desolation. And the children, pale and unhealthy looking, were suspiciously quiet, either in honor of Arthur's arrival or they had no energy for noisy games. For himself, Arthur had always imagined the orphans to be more active. Children are children, after all. But there was something wrong with these ones. We pick mushrooms and berries in the forest in the fall, but not enough, of course. May you all rot there, you damned bastards. She shook her fist at the sky. Arthur was offered a place for the night in one of the empty bedrooms. Torn bed sheets, drafts blowing in from the cracks in the windows. A creaky bed with a net. After thinking for a moment, he kept his t-shirt on to keep warm, and wrapped himself in a thin blanket and began clicking through the day's photos on his camera. With ruthless accuracy the device captured the plaster, tearing off the walls in wet layers. A piece of parquet in the corridor scolded by Mrs. Stevenson and a dangerous crack in the ceiling of the assembly hall, which was now used more as a warehouse. And, of course, pictures of the children. Children, and more children, about 30 in all. Each child is thin and pale, each with an adult longing in his eyes, and each with his own little quirk. In addition to William and his handy glasses, there were Nick, Macy, Anna, Chris. One made dolls out of dried chicken bones and grass, the other marked each past day with a dot on the wall behind the bed. Arthur was too shy to ask what would happen when the wall was finished. There were children who collected broken-off cup handles and others who could spend hours watching the flight of birds. Arthur flipped through the photos from end to beginning, then back again, until he noticed something. In almost every photo, a girl could be seen in the background. The girl had no face. The girl had no face, and at first Arthur took it for a defect in the photograph. Perhaps the girl had moved at that moment and the cheap camera had blurred her features. But after looking at the photos again, he was forced to admit that the camera had nothing to do with it. There was no face. Arms, legs, a dress, all understandable, but smooth skin where people's natural orifices are on their heads, that was not okay. It was as if the room felt colder than before. Arthur shivered, wrapped himself in the blanket as tightly as he could and tried to sleep, at the same time pushing the ominous girls out of his mind. Gradually he turned his thoughts to the article he was writing and fell asleep. Mrs. Stevenson, how many children live in the house? Arthur asked, in the morning. 28, replied the woman. You saw them all yesterday. Here they are, all here. I didn't miss a single one. Do you have a girl like that here? Small, in a dress, with a rather unimpressive face. Arthur hesitated at the description, but then managed to twist himself out of it, but a memorable appearance at all. Mrs. Stevenson looked at him strangely. Brown glass, she sighed at last. At first Arthur was glad that she knew who she was talking about. But then he was puzzled. Well, yes, I took a shard. I looked at the sun. Why, you shouldn't did it, Mrs. Stevenson echoed, and she aged immediately. She chose you, but I didn't realize it, oh God. I should have kept you away. On the other hand, we could use the extra hands. I mean, nail up the parquet. Who chose? Arthur smiled. What hands? What's the matter with you, really? I sincerely hope, of course, that after my article, Carrie is her name, the woman continued, she has no face. If you see her, you're dead. You can't go home. What do you mean? Arthur got nervous. I'll go now. Get in the car and go. Thank you, of course, for your hospitality. And he took a step back, suddenly realizing that Mrs. Stevenson was likely to have gone mad. The age, the stressful job, the environment, the kids, one weirder than the other. She's always been here and always will be. When they built the house here, everything went wrong from the first day. And then they closed it down. She continued her story monotonously, but you can't fix what happened. Look through the green glass when you go back. Everything will become clear. Arthur had no answer to that, so he headed for the exit. 2 shards of glass were lying on the porch railing, casting a cheerful splash of sunlight. The owner of it was nowhere to be seen. Arthur looked around just in case, took the green glass with 2 fingers and, sighing, held it up to his eye. All was well in the green-lit world, except for a large hole in the rotten porch boards. Arthur, feeling weak in the knees, stepped forward and peered cautiously in. There he lay, with his neck twisted badly sideways. The paper from his notebook was scattered, fanning around him. Flies swarmed around the clouded eyes. Arthur dropped the shard and recoiled. In essence, the shard was no longer needed to realize how things really were. On the roof of a car parked outside the gate sat Carrie, a girl with no face. But she had clearly seen Arthur, and waved cheerfully at him.